Days before the invasion of Lebanon by Israel, MIT professor Noam Chomsky sat down with KPFA's Philip Maldari for a lengthy, in-depth interview on the Middle East and Israeli invasion, which Chomsky predicted.
I'm speaking with Professor Noam Chomsky from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Chomsky, I want to talk about the Middle East, and it's such a confusing issue that we might as well start not with square one, which would be going back prior to 1948, but let's start with Camp David. I want to get a sense from you of exactly what you thought of, first of all, Kissinger diplomacy in the Middle East, and then the negotiations and the resultant agreement at Camp David.
Well, to understand the Kissinger diplomacy and what ultimately led to Camp David, one has to go back to about 1970, which is when Kissinger took over control of Middle East policy. And what happened then is very poorly understood, although the documentation is easily accessible if anybody wants to check up what I'm now going to say. What in fact happened is this. At the time that Kissinger took over, American policy was oscillating between two positions. One was what is called the Rogers Plan, Secretary of State William Rogers' position. And that position was essentially that the United States should join the international consensus on this issue, which was to restore the pre-June 1967 borders with some modifications, and to arrange for a peaceful negotiated political settlement on that basis. Incidentally, there was no talk about the Palestinians at that time. So this would have meant, in effect, return of the West Bank to Jordan, and of the Sinai to Egypt, and the Golan Heights to Syria in return for a comprehensive peace settlement. That was the Rogers Plan. Kissinger had a very different position. His position was that the United States should support Israeli control of the occupied territories without any concessions at all. And in fact, even in his memoirs, he describes how he deflected efforts on the part of the State Department or others which aimed at trying to set up some kind of negotiated political settlement, because he didn't want one. He thought that one should rely on Israeli power. Now this was part of the whole Kissinger-Nixon system of relying on surrogate states like Iran and Israel to be the base for the projection of American power. And Israel at that point appeared to be in a position of just overwhelming military dominance, and the same with Iran. And this seemed to be, from the point of view of someone like Kissinger, whose understanding of history and politics is extremely limited and primitive, but who does understand violence very well. He understands the mailed fist. And from that point of view, from the point of view of a real primitive like Kissinger, this seemed a very plausible position. Well, this came into sharp conflict with Sadat's diplomacy, a fact which has been very effectively suppressed in the United States. Sadat came into office in late 1970, and in February 1971, he made a peace offer to Israel, a comprehensive peace offer which went far beyond what he proposed in his trip to Jerusalem in 1977, specifically in that he, too, made no mention of the Palestinians, which is supposed to be the big stumbling block. The proposal that he made was that, actually he accepted a proposal of Gunnar Jarring of the United Nations, which was that there should be a peace settlement with recognized borders and demilitarized zones and the whole panoply of conditions that have been associated with UN resolutions on essentially the pre-June 67 borders. This proposal was this entailed effectively recognition of Israel in a comprehensive peace settlement, and again, let me stress, it said nothing about the Palestinians. Gave them nothing. Now, this was rejected by Israel, and it was rejected by the United States.
It included the return of the Sinai to Egypt.
Right. It returned. It in effect meant that it meant peace in return for evacuation of the occupied territories. Well, this was rejected by Israel, although they recognized it as a genuine peace offer in their terms, and it was rejected by Kissinger in accordance with his position. Well, now since that, for several years after that, Sadat continued to press for a negotiated settlement, and the United States, under Kissinger's direction now of the Middle East, continually refused. Sadat pointed out, and in fact American oil companies pointed out and so on, that this was going to lead to war, that Sadat would be compelled to go to war to achieve what his aims if diplomacy failed. And Kissinger, in effect, rejected that because he assumed, as did most intelligence estimates, that it would be crazy for Egypt to go to war because Egypt was a basket case. They couldn't possibly compete with Israeli power. Well, that led to the October 1973 war, for which Kissinger has primary responsibility. Now, the October 73 war was a big surprise to Israel and to Western intelligence because, in fact, Syria and Egypt came very close to winning. In the early stages of the war, it was a very close thing. In fact, it appears that Israel threatened the use of nuclear weapons unless the United States sent massive conventional arms. They expected such the possibility. They anticipated in the early stages the possibility of a serious defeat. Well, the effect of the war was to sort of dispel some of the clouds in Kissinger's mind, if that's the right term for it, and to get him to comprehend that, in fact, it would be wiser from his point of view to accept Sadat's offer to incorporate Egypt within the American system as an American client state in return to some sort of a peace settlement with Israel. And he then undertook the so-called shuttle diplomacy, the purpose of which was to arrange for some sort of a settlement. It was a kind of compromise between Sadat's position and his former position. The purpose was to basically eliminate Egypt from the Middle East conflict by some sort of an interim settlement in the Sinai, and in fact to turn Egypt towards Africa. And in fact they tried to turn Egypt into a surrogate state like Iran and Israel for American power in Africa. That's not well known but true. And at the same time it retained the earlier aspects of the Kissinger program in that this policy was to permit Israel to retain control over the occupied territories, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Well, that policy went along for several years. By now, Kissinger was... incidentally, in January 1976, the Arab states, including the confrontation states, including Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Syria, and in fact even the PLO, came to the Security Council of the United Nations with a proposal which again called for a comprehensive settlement on the June 67 borders with recognized borders and demilitarized zones and the rest of it, and that was again at this time was vetoed by the United States. This went on for several years. By 1977, Sadat was becoming desperate, and he then made this dramatic trip to Jerusalem, which was impossible to suppress. I mean, the February 71 offer was effectively suppressed. That was quiet diplomacy. But the trip to Jerusalem was just too dramatic, and in fact, it apparently took the United States by surprise. Now it was Carter, not Kissinger, and the United States essentially went along with it and tried to take it over, and tried to utilize it as a way of achieving what is one of the main purposes of the United States in the region, and that is to prevent Europe from playing any role in coordinating affairs in the Middle East. So that also became Camp David.
Of course, also preventing the Soviet Union.
Well, that's what they talk about, but they really don't care. I mean, that's propaganda cover. Nobody expects the Soviet Union to play a major role in areas of prime concern to the United States. They know if the Soviet Union's been very cautious not to interfere in regions which it knows to be at the core of American interest, like the Middle East, because they know that there'd be a nuclear war if they did. And in fact, though we constantly talk about defense of some region against the Soviet Union, if you really sort of unpack those remarks, it turns out that we're really talking about defense against the indigenous population, and in the Middle East against European intrusion. The Europeans are real rivals in the Middle East. Russia is not. The Europeans will get the contracts from Saudi Arabia. The Soviet Union won't.
Let's go back to Camp David. Camp David not only provided for the return of the Sinai to Egypt, it also provided for autonomy negotiations for the Palestinians of Gaza and the West Bank.
Well, that's just a cover for ensuring that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip stay within Israeli control. And in this respect, Camp David was an extension of the Kissinger diplomacy.
Did Sadat basically agree with the notion that the West Bank and Gaza should remain under nominal Israeli control?
Sadat was intelligent enough to realize that his interests, and in fact the interests of elite groups throughout the Arab world, would be best served by suppressing radical nationalism. And the main sort of what inflames radical nationalism in the Middle East, in the Arab countries, is the Palestinian problem. So Sadat, like the Saudi Arabians and other conservative groups that want to be American clients, like them, he assumed that the best solution would be to constrain the Palestinians in some mini-state which would be basically controlled by a Jordanian-Israeli military alliance and supported by the most conservative, in fact, deeply reactionary forces in the Arab world, like Saudi Arabia. That's what Sadat regarded, I suspect, as the best solution from the point of view of the ruling elites in the Arab states. And most of the world agrees, incidentally, but the United States and Israel object, and the autonomy provisions of the Camp David Accord are just a very transparent fig leaf intended primarily for American public opinion, which it was obvious at the time would have exactly the effect that now everybody can see they have had, namely just to lay the basis for further steps towards Israeli annexation. This was quite obvious at the time, but people who said it were, of course, dismissed and attacked in the usual fashion. Now I don't think any rational person can deny it. It's just obvious that that's what it's leading towards. In fact, it's even reached the point where, to my astonishment, a leading Israeli military historian, Amos Perlmutter, who's very hawkish himself, incidentally, had an article in the New York Times a couple of days ago in which he stated that General Sharon, the defense minister, who's really in many ways the leading figure in Israel, he stated, Perlmutter, that Sharon, his plan is to simply expel the Arabs out of the occupied territories.
Let's go and talk about the West Bank for a while. Under the Labor government, there were elections in the West Bank and Gaza in which mayors were elected, and in every case, candidates sympathetic with the PLO were elected in those elections. Since then, those mayors have become the only official representatives of the Palestinian people under Israeli occupation, and they have been a center for opposition to Israeli occupation. Most recently, the Israeli occupiers have put out of office several of the Palestinian mayors and have attempted to set up what are called village leagues, which would work more closely with a civilian leadership in the occupied area under Professor Menachem Milson. What is really happening here?
Well, first of all, we should recognize the significance of the change from military to civilian control. There is a significance, but I think one should be aware of what it is. Milson himself, for example, I think is a reserve colonel in the Army. And the shift from military to civilian control simply means a shift towards annexation, just as it did in the Golan Heights. What we correctly call the virtual annexation of the Golan Heights, in effect, was a switch from military to civilian legal structure. That's the device that's used to take the next step towards annexation. So the Likud policy, the policy that you're describing, that's associated with Milson and Sharon, of extending civilian rule over the West Bank, while that has a sort of a benign sound to it, after all, we'd prefer civilian rule to military rule. In effect, that's quite the opposite. What it means is it's a step towards actual annexation. And the next thing after civilian rule is further integration, and the ultimate result of that is outright annexation. It's clear that that's what Likud is drifting towards. Now, the Labor Party program was quite different. I would argue more cynical, but at least different. The Labor Party position associated with Moshe Dayan, and actually it's called the Alon Plan, named after Yigal Alon, who was the foreign minister at one time, that this plan was for Israel to essentially take what it wanted in the occupied territories. So to take the Jordan Valley and a substantial area around Jerusalem and the water and agricultural resources, just essentially to take what it needed, but to not take over the areas of heavy population concentration. And the reason was, and the people who lived in the population, at least the heavy concentrated population, they would either be left, they would be, if they wanted, if Jordan would agree, they could become Jordanian citizens under Israeli military control, or else they'd simply be left stateless. which is the worst possible position for a human being in a world of nation states. That means no protection against any arbitrary act of state power. That was the Labour Party position, and the reason for it was that they're concerned with what they call, somewhat euphemistically, the demographic problem. Namely, under the Begin plan, under the plan which is plainly going towards annexation, there'll be a very substantial Arab population in the Jewish state. By the year 2000, it might be, say, half. And the question is, what happens then? Well, what happens is you just become like South Africa. I mean, already the Arab population in the Jewish state is necessarily second-class citizens, but within the borders of Israel, it's like 15%. If in an expanded Israel, it'll pretty soon be something like 50%. And the mechanisms that are used to deprive them of the primary rights of citizenship, while they can easily be disguised, or readily easily disguised when it's a small minority, that'll be extremely difficult as they're a larger part of the population. Now, the people they have to disguise them from are primarily American public opinion. That's the important thing. And that'll become harder and harder. The Labour Party realized that. They're much more attuned to American public opinion and the need to propagandize effectively than the Likud is, and for that reason they wanted to exclude the areas of heavy population concentration and to essentially leave them to their own devices. That's why they had the elections.
So what is Begin's solution?
Well,
You're saying he wants to annex.
Begin wants to invade, to annex, and then what happens to the population? Well, it's not clear. Now, Perlmutter's statement that I just quoted, the statement of this Israeli military historian, is rather close to Sharon, that Sharon intends to simply drive them out. That certainly is a position which is well represented in the population. Polls indicate that. But the government has been very careful never to express itself in those terms. This is the first time I've ever seen it stated boldly on the part of anyone close to the government. I mean, Perlmutter's not part of the government. He's a military historian, but he does reflect the opinions in the... It is not his opinion, incidentally. He's critical of it, but he was willing to state it. Now, that's the logic of it. The logic of the annexation program is expulsion. Now, I don't know if Israel will be willing to... I think that probably that could only be done in the context of a military conflict. So, for example, let's say, I think it's not unlikely that Israel will invade Lebanon soon. They've been trying to provoke a PLO action that would lead to invasion for months, and sooner or later they'll do it. And that could lead to a more general regional war. And in that context, it could be quite possible to expel the population.
You're talking about basically going through Palestinian cities on the West Bank and using weapons and threats to force people across the Jordan River.
In the context of a war, all sorts of things can be done. I mean, there will be atrocities, not necessarily programmed atrocities, but they just happen. There'll be acts of resistance, there'll be repression of resistance, and in that context, there tends to be population flight. I mean, you can take apart all the details, and they're different from... Sometimes it's outright expulsion. Sometimes it's people fleeing in fear. Sometimes they're fleeing because they think maybe they'll be able to get back and do even better. All sorts of reasons. But in both 1948, 49, and in 1967, there was a very substantial departure of the population. Part of it expulsion, part of it flight. In fact, after the 1967 war, certainly as late as November of that year, according to the UN commander, Norwegian Odd Bull, Israel was still literally expelling Palestinians across the river. But the point is, in the complex conditions of actual war, a departure, to put it in the most neutral terms, a departure of the population, or a large part of it, is not at all unlikely. It's happened in the past, and it could happen again. Short of that, it's extremely hard to... in fact, there are plans. The General Yariv, who's... formerly, I forget exactly what, but associated with intelligence, announced in Israel a couple of years ago that there were explicit plans for expulsion of the population in the event of war. And this position attributed to Sharon the other day is a much stronger statement of that. But it's hard to... you have to be pretty naive to doubt that that's, in the background of thinking. And I don't really see any other solution within the Begin framework, unless they're willing to go towards basically South Africa. Simply open and blatant denial of rights to, what will soon be a majority of the population.
Again, that was MIT professor Noam Chomsky speaking in April of 1982, just days before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, to KPFA's Philip Maldari.